Hi, everyone, and welcome to our very first Global Antitrust Institute discussion forum. I'm Josh Wright, Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute and Professor of Law at Scalia Law at George Mason University. And what a timely and wonderful topic for our inaugural discussion forum. We've got Professor Tim Wu and his book. I've loaded for bear as proof that I read it. The Curse of Bigness. Timely also because Tim just, I think yesterday or maybe 2 days ago, released a supplement to the book. It's available on Amazon and SSRN and everywhere you want to go get it. And today's discussion will use Professor Wu's book, which advances the central claim that the anti and antitrust is gone. It's been abandoned. The consumer welfare standard, among other things, have enfeebled modern antitrust law. And he sets forth a path to restore what he describes as a Brandeisian vision of antitrust. We'll hear from Professor Wu about the book and that vision, and from the other panelists we've brought together here, and maybe me a little bit because I can't help it, about Professor Wu's central claim and some questions sort of at the heart of debates about what modern antitrust should be, what it is, and what it might be moving forward. First, let me begin by introducing our panelist. Professor Wu is the Julius Silver Professor of Law, Science and Technology at Columbia Law School. Tim was enforcement counsel in the New York Attorney General's office, worked on competition policy in the National Economic Council for the Obama White House, worked in the FTC on antitrust enforcement, and in 2014 was a Democratic primary candidate for Lieutenant Governor of New York. Tom Hazlett is the H.H. Macaulay Endowed Professor of Economics at Clemson, may or may not get football back this season, specializing in the information economy and former chief economist at the FCC. Michael Kades is Director for Markets and Competition Policy at the Washington Center for Equitable Growth. Prior to joining Equitable Growth, Michael worked as antitrust counsel for Senator Amy Klobuchar on the Senate Judiciary Subcommittee on Antitrust Competition and Consumer Rights, and as an attorney at the Federal Trade Commission. During his time at the FTC, Michael was attorney advisor to then Chairman John Leibowitz. And last but certainly not least, my colleague, Judge Douglas Ginsburg, Senior Circuit Judge on the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals, professor at Scalia Law, and chairman of GAI's International Advisory Board. We've already explained the rules of engagement in the locker room before the fight, and so the panelists know what we're doing. Professor Wu will open and talk about the book and the thesis it advances, and we'll sort of circulate for rebuttals and back to Tim before we do a little bit of Q&A and moderated session and so forth. So with that, Professor Wu, thank you for joining us, and why don't you kick us off?
Thank you very much, Josh. Thanks for staging this event, and thanks to the panelists for reading the book, or at least I hope you have. I know the people who reviewed the book probably read it, although and no, I really, I mean, every author wants their stuff to be read, and I really appreciate you guys giving us some time, even if you are going to tear it to pieces. That's fine with me. So I wrote this book out of an interest in antitrust revival. And out of a kind of a curiosity and a fascination with the American invention of antitrust. So the way I see it, and I think the tradition that this book wants to restore, is of antitrust as a rather ingenious reaction to the excesses of monopoly capitalism. Invented in the late 19th century, kind of tooled around with for the first half of the 20th century. I think it was, and I believe, and the book strongly suggests that it was a reaction to monopoly capitalism of the 19th century that was different than socialism, and in fact, an effort in some ways to avoid socialist answers. It took the domination of the economy by large trusts as a great danger. suggested that would have pernicious economic consequences and social and political consequences for the country, and tried to come up with something that didn't involve the government running the entire economy. The basic premise of that book is that we've lost sight of some of the core elements of that tradition. That while we may be more economically sophisticated now and have other learnings, that we have drifted away from some of the core mission of the antitrust law, preventing domination of industries by one or two or three large players, and we've lost some of the enforcement tradition, which I think has been very important to that project. So let me discuss three things in particular I want to highlight about what I consider the classic antitrust tradition, originating at the turn of the beginning of the 20th century, and probably at its height in a regrown in the post-war period. So first, is something I think is very important is a overarching faith in decentralization in competition as opposed to centralized planning. So I'm the kind of person who is opposed to both excessive big government planning and private industry big monopoly planning. And I think some of the genius, to my mind, about antitrust is that it puts its faith in competition, puts its faith in the idea that a centralized economy over the long run is a better bet than either a monopolized economy or central planning by the government. And that's achieved a number of ways: blocking mergers, Section 2 activity, and so forth. But that I think is an important part of it. A second part, and this is related to the first, is the idea that there is something important about the structure of of major markets for this sort of society you're going to live in and the kind of economy you're going to live in. I think that the founders of the antitrust law they didn't sort of, in my view, see it as it depends on cost benefit in every individual case. I think they had a view of the economy that was more regionalized, believed in a greater number of smaller producers over a larger number of producers. I think they had a kind of a choice they wanted to make that they thought was more likely to give an economy that was consistent with the economic results they wanted, but also with a democratic structure for the United States. And that's my third part of the older tradition that I think is important. Is I think that some of the original goals of antitrust were not only economic, although I think that's usually should be the forefront, but in the back of the mind of enforcement, in a figure like Theodore Roosevelt, for example, was the premise or the concern that a monopolized economy, too much private power, was at some level a threat to democracy. So I'm not suggesting that they were supposed to conceive of the law as political in this sort of narrow or raw sense, but more in the sense that it was safer for democracy to have an active antitrust tradition. And Roosevelt was very, very specific about this. He often said, we have to sort of figure out who's in charge here. And I think he was very concerned that without an antitrust program, you'd lead to even more serious reactions. In his time, he was worried about socialist or anarchist revolution. So, in some ways, I see it as a choice. And I'm pitching this to this group as a slightly right of center group. There is going monopoly capitalism does lead to a reaction, and one version of the reaction is extensive regulation leading towards socialism. Another is an active antitrust program. You can kind of think that you can get away with nothing, but I think at some point the concentration of centralized power, of private power, will become unbearable. And I think you're seeing it now in some of the populist uprisings on the left and the right. I don't say are only the consequence of lack of antitrust enforcement, obviously, but are related to it and related to the failures to keep some controls on private power. So that's a very broad overview of the book. I'm sure people here have more specific things to say about it, but that's what kind of the idea I was trying to achieve with this book, is to take another look back, see what antitrust's sort of founding traditions are, and see whether they have relevance to our times. Done.
Done.
Under budget. Under time.
Perfect. We'll reserve your time for the back end. Tom, you want to take the first round of responses?
Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for inviting me. Thanks to Tim Wu for writing the book. Yes, I read it a long time before I heard about this. And I don't know. The only curse words in here are on the cover, by the way, in the title. No, it's yes. I read all your books, Tim. I got it. In fact, I've assigned your book. Who Controls the Internet is one of my favorites, but you got to write a new version of that, I guess, so we can reassign it. So thank you for your contribution to antitrust. And I will say I have a bit of a different view on the origins of antitrust. Let me start briefly right there. That you say that antitrust was a reaction to the excesses of monopoly capitalism. Of course, during this period of the original statutes, there was some common law antitrust, but the 1890 Sherman Act and the acts to follow, these come right with really historic growth. Massive immigration in the United States, precisely because low-wage jobs are so plentiful and growth is so impressive. And the United States is undergoing the Industrial Revolution, maybe the second wave of the Industrial Revolution, leading to the what Deidre McCloskey calls the Great Enrichment. These are absolutely positive events in the history of economic development, and there was a lot of reaction to it, certainly, and the upheaval, the tumult in what's happening in society is leading to political readjustments. By the way, one of the nice things about reading your books, Tim, is I never know when you're going to drop in some great historical intellectual figure, whether it be Schumpeter or Hayek or Brandeis, and you do make it interesting for a lot of us. So that you've got a very good style on that. Here we're talking more about Brandeis in this book, of course, The Curse of Bigness, but Schumpeter's view about the absolutely profound and efficient consequences of economies of scale coming in during this period of time was creating a political response, including populist responses. And in fact, I think it's very important to actually look at what the debate was in 1890. The Republican response was the Sherman Act. And it was, in fact, a cover story, according to Ida Tarbell, who wrote a very nice book on the tariff. She said it was a response because the Republican agenda at that time, and in fact, if you look at even Senator Sherman's memoirs, the key proposal in that Congress was not the Sherman Antitrust Act. That was not really a game changer. It was the McKinley tariff, which was a historically high tariff. And the Democrats in 1887 under President Cleveland, it actually defined the debate. If you want to do something about competition in the marketplace and protecting workers and consumers, please allow foreign competition, reduce the tariffs, and expose the trust to competition. And the Republicans, as a cover story, as a run-up to their incredibly high, the highest tariffs ever that were imposed in the McKinley Act that came later that year, wanted to have some kind of political cover, and that was it. That certainly the Ida Tarbell story, I think, is very compelling. And there was not an upheaval in the marketplace. There was, in some cases, more integration and a horizontal merger wave in the late 1890s that probably was a result of enforcement of some price-fixing rules and so forth. But there was not a turnaround. That was part of course, the reason that Brandeis in the Federal Trade Commission Act thought he was doing something, but that didn't even really create a big turnaround in the marketplace. I think that's fairly much consensus. We may want to argue about it, but that history actually is quite useful as well. There's something in Tim's book I might just want to comment on, because it goes to so many of these issues, and it has to do with the big antitrust case, U.S. versus AT&T. And we agree on some things, certainly, and we disagree on others. So maybe I could take a minute. How much time do I have left? A couple of minutes?
Fine, Tom. Okay,
we're good. Okay. So trying to be efficient here, because there are a lot of people on the panel that need to talk. Yes, through the antitrust case, 1974 to 1982, and then the actual divestiture of AT&T in 1984, the United States really did get past the monopoly market structure at the heart of telecommunications. It led, I think, as Tim says, to really help lead the internet revolution. And we did a lot better than Europe. We did a lot better than Japan. Other affluent countries have even to this day, they're still more stuck on the state monopoly model. And so we got a lot out of it. We also saw that after, we saw through the case, as Tim writes in his book, that we saw how much innovation that AT&T was crushing. And that's really interesting, because since not just 1934 in the Communications Act, but literally since 1910 in the Mann-Elkins Act, we had applied common carrier regulation to AT&T. And this is the problem. The dynamics are not really perfectly played out, so to speak. And this common carrier regulation, which we seem to think in some cases may even help us today with the internet, broadband, is very costly. The trade-offs are large, certainly. Some of us think that they're really quite negative, and certainly the AT&T case, I think, showed that innovation, very valuable innovation, was being held back, and the benefits were negative, the net benefits of common carrier regulation. And that was a long and very elaborate field experiment. So it is not the case, also, as Tim talks about in his book, that as soon as we got past AT&T and saw the internet emerging, that we turned things around by allowing mergers to reconstitute the AT&T monopoly. By the way, you might want to check this, Tim, that you say that the Bush administration allowed the regional Bell operating companies, the local operators, to merge back into just two companies nationwide, and you blame it on the Bush administration. That actually happened under the Clinton administration. So factually, that's 1997 to 99, basically. But that's not, that was an application of current antitrust law. The local markets did not change in concentration. The integration across the country did not hurt. What really helped that entire market, of course, coming out of the 96 Telecom Act, and finally some very, very important reforms about 2004, was that we allowed the internet to compete. We allowed entry. And, Tim talks a little bit about this, but leaves out the key elements. It was not AT&T versus, US versus AT&T. It was liberalization of spectrum and allowing there to be a much more fluid and unregulated wireless network evolve, multiple networks evolve in relation and in direct rivalry to the incumbent telecommunications operators. We also allowed cable as an unregulated entrant to, in fact, enter the broadband business and, in fact, enter the voice telephony business. And today, as we sit here, I mean, talking about the early 2000s seems very quaint, because the idea that we had a telephone monopoly has really quite disappeared. The telephone monopoly was a wireline residential connection, and that connection is gone. Now we have phone companies and cable operators and wireless firms providing broadband, and most American households don't even have a traditional phone line. And by traditional, I mean wire. The phone company lines are only about half that. Half of them are cable lines, and less than 40% of the market actually relies on that. About 60% is wireless only. So that has been eclipsed. The old world has been eclipsed. Innovation has come into the market by deregulation. And by the way, the key, according to, of course, the FCC's official history, the key to allowing voice over internet, and in fact allowing the ISPs to come and create new markets for internet services, came when we eliminated common carrier regulation, meaning that an AOL does not have to be a company with a certificate of convenience and necessity by a state public utilities commission. They don't have to pay access fees, have universal service requirements, and have other price regulation associated with the so-called Title II of the 1934 Communications Act. That was absolutely elementary. That came in the 1980s, that we eliminated those common carrier restrictions and allowed for the ISPs to form, and internet service providers like AOL and Prodigy, and then all the rest to follow. And then you have the 2004 order, the Pulver order, that eliminates if it looks like a duck and walks like a duck, it must be a duck thinking. That was to say that the original response by federal and particularly state regulators was that voice over internet had to be regulated like the old phone companies. And you had to be, and in fact, of course, the old phone companies loved that and backed that completely. The regional bell operating companies wanted licensing of the new services, so as a barrier to entry. In fact, the innovators applied, particularly Jeff Pulver, applied to get that eliminated. So through that deregulation, through spectrum liberalization, through measures to pare back common carrier rules, we have actually gotten very, very dynamic competition that's led to enormous gains. We're seeing some of the benefits of this through the pandemic and the ability of our common carrier, formerly common carrier, now unregulated private common carrier services, to actually keep up with large bursts in demand. And this spills over, of course, into vast areas of the internet, and I'll leave that
there you go
for the others.
I don't have a card to quietly hold up. Your time is up, or a hook to
I was just getting to it.
Appreciate it. Michael, you're up next.
Okay, thank you. I'm gonna just start out by saying I'm not a telecom guy. So I don't have a lot to say about the history of AT&T. But I guess what I think is interesting about Tim's book, I sort of think about it as in three parts. So one, sort of the context is there's a claim that there is a problem in the economy with concentration, and that there's a problem with bigness. And the second point being, I'm sorry, I have to move the mouse because it's right on my eye. The second point being that what role does antitrust, can it really play? And here I think what's interesting about Tim's book is I think he's really offering a very different interpretation. He's really trying to sort of save the antitrust enforcement from what had been, I think, sort of a consensus position that antitrust in the 30s, the 40s, the 50s, the 60s just got conceivably worse. And I think Tim makes a really compelling case that that's not right, and that antitrust had a really important role to play. And then I think what comes out in the chapter Tim just released, is sort of the role of Thurman Arnold. And what's sort of interesting about talking about how Thurman Arnold was successful in rejuvenating antitrust enforcement, it sort of echoes some of the same sort of ideas that I think you hear from a lot of, I think, economists and scholars on the left, which would include me. I think I traveled in that group. I hope when Tim said, it was center right, he was, looking at the mean or the median, not the mode. Right, but John Baker sort of made this point that what Thurman Arnold really did was sort of take the political intuitions of antitrust, as a goal, but in terms of enforcement doctrine, looking at really going after things that were economically based. And so what I see is sort of what I sort of take away from all of this is that the goals of the benefits of antitrust enforcement go beyond economics, but that antitrust as an enforcement tool in the courts needs to be based on economics. And I think that there's a lot to be said for that. So I don't, sometimes the debate, people seem to imply that courts should be blocking mergers for non-economic reasons. I don't take Tim to be saying that, but he can obviously disagree. And certainly the correlation between economic power and political power is not one-to-one. But I think having the value of having stringent antitrust enforcement is you have this positive externality that you're less likely to have economic power affecting the political process. So I think really what this book does better than anything else, it's really the first attempt in my professional lifetime for someone to really try to really revive the principles of progressive antitrust enforcement in a coherent way. So that's sort of my reaction to the book, and why I think I'm sympathetic to it is, maybe getting a little moving down from theory is, my experience in antitrust enforcement is between 1997 and the time I left the commission, antitrust enforcement, the two biggest things that antitrust enforcement did was revitalize hospital merger enforcement and deal with pharmaceutical patent settlements. And so one can say that those were successes, but I think to think back, neither of those questions were particularly hard. And that we went a decade where the government didn't challenge a hospital merger because of, I think, the misuse of critical loss analysis. There was mass consolidation in that market. That competition's never coming back. That was a huge cost to society. And it wasn't related, maybe part of the litigation results were industry specific, but a lot of it, I think, reflected sort of over the problems with the existing consensus. And similarly, the on reverse payments, I think is the same issue that fundamentally the economic incentives that were modeled are overwhelming. There is no reason to think that there's actually an equilibrium solution to a reverse payment that's pro-competitive. It's always dominated by an anti-competitive settlement. And we were one vote short of the Supreme Court saying that those deals are basically beyond Supreme Court review. And so, I read Tim's book at the big level, and I look at what antitrust is struggling to deal with. And I think that makes me very concerned that our antitrust law is insufficient to do the job that we need it to do. So I don't know if I'm under or over, but I think that's a good place to stop.
You're right on time, Michael. Right on time.
Well, I am never on time for anything, so this is a good day.
Right on time and bang on target also, I'll say.
Judge?
Thanks, Josh. Well, first, let me say, I think I see the book as arising from a sort of nostalgic view of an Edenic time when Theodore Roosevelt was carrying a big stick, and I think Tim said brought 40 cases against trust, something like that. Taft, following on, brought 75 cases. And I think Tim says in the book by the end of the 19 teens or maybe into the 20s, the trusts were basically tamed and gone. Now, that was the target of the immediate target of the Antitrust Act. And it's not surprising if there isn't the same volume of litigation, the same prominence of problems like that. I mean, that was the low-hanging fruit, and it was picked, and we're all better off for it, I think. So there's a sort of a continuing lament in the book for the lack of big cases against monopolies, Section 2 cases, with the aim of breaking them up. And I think one of the recommendations, Tim, is that if a firm is dominant for 10 years, that it be investigated and potentially broken up. A sort of presumption that something is wrong if it's whatever legitimate basis it had for becoming a monopoly, an innovation, a first mover advantage, that hasn't been dissipated by new entry, then something is wrong. Well, first, I want to just take us back a bit to the Section 2, the experience with Section 2 over the last 40 years. Starting with the AT&T case, which is mentioned in the book. It's not prominent, but it's discussed as one of the bright spots in that tradition coming from the early breakup cases, and I think, and then there's a lament, and I'll just read it as a sentence. The AT&T monopoly, which had been forced to divide into 8 pieces, was allowed over the 2000s to reconstitute itself into 2 giant firms, Verizon and AT&T. Now, and then I should say later, well, that's right. That was, at some point it says this was a disgrace for the Bush administration to have allowed it, and I think Tom's addressed that briefly. Now, this reflects, I think, a basic misunderstanding of what the case, why the case was brought, and how it ended up being settled as it was. This case was brought, well, take it another way, to put another way. I'm not sure what happened when it was brought in 1968. When it was settled in 1982 by Assistant Attorney General Bill Baxter, it was seen as the problem that was seen was not that there was a monopoly phone service in every part of the country. There were about 12 or 1,400 independent phone companies, not part of the Bell system. They occupied a small share of the market. GTE was by far the biggest, and it was not small. But there was a practical matter of a Bell system AT&T monopoly. And the problem that we saw with that monopoly was not that it was displacing competition in plain old telephone service, POTS, P-O-T-S. That was impractical. In fact, it only became even a possibility when microwave technology was introduced. And of course, AT&T did what it could with the FCC to squelch the entry of microwave competition through MCI Corporation. The main purpose of the case, at least as we saw it from 1981 forward, was that the AT&T system spanned these tariffed telephony markets and competitive markets, particularly in equipment and also in services. And those markets were potentially competitive. And there was no reason at all, that everything attached to the system had to be made by Western Electric or otherwise deemed acceptable by AT&T. It was a fraud on the FCC to claim that there was a technical problem with it. And that kept out all sorts of attachments, so-called foreign attachments, as you mentioned in the book, to the network. So the key to the case was not introducing competition in plain old telephone service. It was separating tariffed monopoly service from competitive or potentially competitive markets. And the agreement that was reached between Professor Baxter, Assistant Attorney General Baxter, and the president of AT&T was 2 companies, a tariff monopoly company and a competitive company. And AT&T was going to be the competitive company, and all of the local service companies, the Bell operating companies, were going to be held in the monopoly holding company. It became 7 regional monopoly holding companies because Judge Green got this idea that maybe these companies would start competing into each other's territories or otherwise competing with each other. Well, that seems fanciful, and it proved to be impractical. And so he said, that's what he wanted. So AT&T said, we don't care. We're going to go into the competitive businesses and leave all that behind. We don't care if it's one company or seven companies. And Baxter didn't care for the same reason. That wasn't the point of the case. So we got what we wanted, and that unleashed the innovation that Tom's described, that you allude to in the book. And we reaped enormous benefits from that, partly for completely unanticipated reasons with regard to the rise of wireless and mobile communications. So the loss of those 7 companies is no loss at all, as far as that's concerned. Verizon, as it turns out, there's plenty of competition in wireless, and as Tom said, that's becoming the mode anyway. So let's move on to the next big landmark in this arc of history that Tim describes, and that's the Microsoft case, and of which we both approve, I hope, I'm sure. But there Tim laments that after the remand, the administration, the Bush administration, settled the case with less than divestitures, whereas the district court had proposed to break the company up into 2, an applications company and an operating system company. And there was some logic to that, to be sure, but it was premised on a number of unlawful anti-competitive practices. Let's just say, for simplicity, there were 10. And after the appeal, it turns out there weren't 10. There were, let's say, 7. And so the case goes back to the district court to exercise its discretion as to what the remedy should be. The Court of Appeals is not going to dictate that. And that's when the settlement occurs. And the remedy is not divestiture, but the imposition of a code of practices and a government monitor for 10 years. I think it was extended by 2 more, Tom, wasn't it, to 12? In any event, a monitor inside the company, reporting quarterly to the district court, jointly with a representative from the company, and terminating unlawful practices, preventing new ones from arising. And what we saw was a great deal of space opened now for the entry of competition on a lot of different margins. And again, I think a great success without the big bang divestiture. Finally, for this round comment, 2009, the next administration comes in, and President Obama's first Assistant Attorney General for Antitrust, Christine Varney, says right out of the chute, we're going to bring some Section 2 cases. This has gone on too long. We need to have these big Section 2 cases. She's there for a couple of years, and the department brings one case that involves Arizona, a hospital system in Arizona that monopolized, I think, a county market. That was the Section 2 case, and it wasn't litigated. It was settled. Now, clearly, Christine Varney would have taken the low-hanging fruit if it were there, right? Even the not-so-low-hanging fruit. There's no question that she was sincere in stating her aims. But those cases don't come along, at least good ones don't come along, because of the enormous success that antitrust has had. And in recent 2-3 years, I've seen lamentations about the lack of big international cartels coming to light through the amnesty program. Think about maybe the possibility is that they aren't very common anymore because of the deterrence. And when you see cartel agreements around the world, and I've heard this from lawyers now in South America and in Europe, when you see cartel agreements, international, multinational, big cartel agreements, and they carve out the United States, you know we've done something right. They don't want to get involved in our criminal penalties for this. This has been an enormous success, 130 years and counting. So maybe we could do better, Tim. We'll get back in the next round to the details. But I think you're a little overly concerned.
My turn now, right, Josh?
Yeah, it's your turn. Fire away, and we're plenty ahead of time. So go ahead.
Well, good. Well, I'll try not to spend too much time on AT&T, although it's been brought up. So I want to turn right away to this question of low-hanging fruit. I think it's an interesting, and let me rephrase the critique and put it this way. So yes, so a big part of the book is about the big case tradition and the enforcement tradition in antitrust. And Judge, your critique suggests, well, and I think there's something to this, that Roosevelt and Taft, when they were enforcing the law, well, they had monopoly trusts that had dominated the economy. So, you know, you have a law that outlaws monopolization. That was easy work for them. And then to extend your point, Thurman Arnold, late 1930s, was looking at an economy that was cartelized, extensively covered by cartels, based partially on government policy in the New Deal, early New Deal, where they had authorized the formation of cartels. But the economy was full of cartels, and so for him it was it was easy for him to bring whatever he brought, like 1,200 cases in 4 years or something, because he was it was just out there. The only thing I would disagree with is the idea that our time is completely devoid of targets, or that there aren't, problems in our times that in some ways mirror the problems of earlier times. And I'll lead this into a discussion eventually of Section 2 cases, AT&T, Microsoft, IBM, which I also think are important. I think that, and I think one of the reasons I was motivated to write this book is I think our economy has become less competitive, has shifted more towards some of the structure that we saw in the late 20th century and other periods. I think we've had a pattern of having merger control, which has been unsuccessful or sometimes too lax. I think we have therefore seen a number of industries reduce themselves to either regional monopolies or tight oligopolies, which are both essentially loopholes in the antitrust laws. That's true when you think about the cable industry, true when you think about airlines reduced to 3 or 4 competitors, true sometimes vertically with mergers like Ticketmaster, the Ticketmaster merger, true in a different sense in the farm industry, where there's all kinds of episodes of monopoly pricing, some sort of vaguely justified by patent, others created by different circumstances. More recently, wireless reducing to 3 players. So I think you have had, if not a monopolization, oligopolization, particularly over the last 10 years, fueled by cheap debt, which has had the same kind of economic consequences. Now, it may be coming in slightly different forms, but had many of the same economic consequences that were so troubling in the late 19th and early 20th century. In many cases, the ability to price without restraint, a gross dissatisfaction, persistent problems of inequality, a sense of political corruption, desire to drain the swamp, a lot of populist anger against what people see is an economy stacked against them. So I think we are, facing some of the same problems. Does that mean you can sort of easily, it doesn't mean they don't have, I agree with the point, you don't have the same targets. And that's why it requires a sort of a thoughtful approach to see what you deal with economic structures that are causing some of the same problems in our time. And I would probably point the finger at lack of merger control and the failure to successfully, and I have to blame the courts here as well, recognize the pattern of anti-competitive mergers in many of the industries in our time. Well, that leads me to the big gaze tradition. Unfortunately, we have this problem that we seem to be agreeing on something, which is the success of some of the big Section 2 cases over the last 30 years, ending with Microsoft. And a reason I feature those cases is, I'm less concerned. I do lament some of the remedies, but even a case that had no real remedy, IBM, I think those cases were collectively, the trilogy of AT&T, IBM, and Microsoft had an enormous impact on opening up the markets in those areas, personal computing, telecom, and eventually browser-based platform development, opening them up to a very innovative, very competitive process that I think made the United States, which at one point, in the 80s and 90s, there was a lot of talk, well, what about Japan? And, they've got a much better approach. They choose the winners, and they're doing great. In fact, propelled the United States into a place of essentially unquestioned technological supremacy. And I think that had not only a lot to do with our venture capital and the open expertise, but also a lot to do with the market structure and something to do with those three cases. And the question is, what does that mean for our time? Well, maybe I'll focus on the question of big tech. So, I think that here's an example of a failure of the imagination was in allowing the major tech platforms to buy almost all of their rivals in the 2010s. Facebook, I think, is the most obvious example. They sort of vacuumed up many of their potential rivals. The emails that have come out from Facebook surrounding the acquisition of WhatsApp, for example, show a company which is pretty straightforwardly looking for the most dangerous companies out there and seeking to neutralize them or acquire them. And I think that's a hole in this sort of trilogy. Look, that story isn't over. There's investigations of those companies right now. But I think that to sit back and say everything's fine, I profoundly disagree with that. I think it doesn't reflect how the economy is working for people. I'll take the point that it's a lot less easy to point to the price fixing cartel or the JP Morgan style monopoly that, as in the case of U.S. Steel, assembled 100 companies together and made them into one monopoly. The lawyers on the defense side are too smart to do the most obvious things. But I think the challenge is we've replicated many of the market conditions, much of the lack of competition that we had in the early 20th century through means that are just, technically compliant with the antitrust laws, but contrary to its spirit. And that's I think, the dilemma we face, and that's why I wrote this book, to try to revive and bring back antitrust, as I've said, as an alternative to what I think we otherwise will face, which is increasing calls for regulation, planning of the economy, and more centralized solutions.
Thanks, Tim. Any of my students watching are saying they've never seen me quiet for 45 minutes straight.
Yes, let's hear what Josh has to say.
Let me. I think I'm just supposed to ask questions, but I can't. Okay. I can't help.
Say whatever you want. I want to hear what you have to say.
I'm gonna ask a loaded question, prefaced with a speech. So, I think I want to shift us a little bit to the vision for sort of antitrust moving forward. Like, what do you want us to do? That type of question.
Sure.
And I think, to me, the most provocative part of the book, and I promise I'll convert this to a question, but the most provocative part of the book, I think, in your discussion of Robinson-Patman, and I think also in the discussion of merger policy, you get pretty close to saying, and I think in Robinson-Patman you say directly, well, if we end up with more inefficient firms and higher prices or less competition of some sort, that's fine, because we're getting some other values in exchange for it. And I want to push on that a little bit, sure, about what our objective function sort of is under this vision, right? So if it's that less concentration makes everyone better off, fine, everything, it's easy, right? But if you look at, for example, what I think the sort of most recent papers on sort of concentration and competitive outcomes are, and I'm like David O'Toole and Rossi Hansberg, and there's a handful of these papers that I think spell out something like the following for stylized facts. And if you want to get into the papers, we can, but this is sort of, I think, a fair description of what they're finding. Increase in sector level concentration, right? So Obama's CEA report finds, sort of big changes in sector kind of broad level concentration, not product markets. Decrease in product market concentration. So there's a banking paper that does this. So, I used to go outside my door 40 years ago and there were 100 banks, but there were 2 in my neighborhood. Now there's 6, but they're all in my neighborhood, right? It's the sort of stylized fact story that they're telling. So less nationwide concentration in a bunch of sectors, more nationwide concentration, but sort of also more product market level competition, increase in markups because of differentiation, but also an increase in output. And so the story these guys tell is efficient expansion of kind of big firms, right? It's a particular version of economies of scale or scope story. Mm-hmm. That kind of forces a trade-off discussion, right? So rather than debate the premise over whether those studies are right or something, because I think you sort of probably do accept that there's some trade-off here that we would get in terms of a push for less concentration, reinvigorating merger review, or the Robinson-Patman Act will sort of keep it broad to level the playing field or to get these other benefits that we are accepting. And I'll broaden even beyond mergers and Robinson-Patman, right? So the studies out, billions and billions of dollars of consumer surplus coming out of these tech markets, right? That we will deconcentrate and surely lose a bunch of consumer surplus, either in the form of prices or convenience or quality or whatever. In the traditional, what I think of modern antitrust as doing is saying, no, if you want to get those other values, you do it outside of antitrust. You sort of, we have laws for other things, and you keep that outside of antitrust for some combination of reasons. Either we don't want judges or bureaucrats making those trade-offs. And I think the most provocative part to me of your book is you say, well, sure we do, right? And so here's my question, and I promised it would end in a question, so here it is. Here's my question to you, and I think we can sort of broaden out the policy kind of trade-off discussion here. What do the people get in exchange for taking money out of their pocket, right? So if you accept that the trade-offs exist, we're taking money, welfare, surplus out of their pocket, and they're getting something in your vision. They're getting in exchange for that. Mm-hmm. And so I guess my question is, what is it that they're getting? Mm-hmm. Why is that a good deal? And I guess a second part of that is, why do we want 5 bureaucrats at the FTC making those trade-offs, or a judge?
All right, so that's a good question. So my first answer to it, you've asked as a policy question, and I respect that, but I'm going to answer it first as a constitutional question, or as an authority question. So let's take the Robinson-Patman Act. In my view, the Robinson-Patman Act is willing to tolerate less efficient retailers in exchange for what it believes will be greater strength of regional economies, more local owners, and maybe even a revival, main streets that are more vibrant. Now you can. One argument you can say is that, well, that's not going to happen with Robinson-Patman. It's a bad law. Okay, so that's one type of critique. But the constitutional question is whether Congress gets to make that choice or not. And I think they do. And so part of the answer is, maybe even if it is, if that's the trade-off they want to do, if they want to favor local business, they sometimes get to do that, even if you think it's a bad idea. It's a little bit like the fact that Congress subsidizes farmers, subsidizes ethanol, subsidizes all kinds of things. Most trade economists think that's a bad idea. They have certain exceptions, maybe. where you get it exactly right, but I think it's a bad idea. So one question, and I think a big question, is whether you get to do that or not. So that's my first answer. And I think the answer is yes, and I think it's illegitimate, therefore, or it has been illegitimate for judges and enforcement counsel to effectively decide that Congress doesn't get to do that. Part of Robinson-Patman, maybe the problem with it is it was passed and to be executed by an antitrust enforcers. If Congress really wanted it to have its effects, maybe it should have had it in a different agency like Small Business Administration. Okay, so that's one answer is a little bit of a dodge that, as you can probably guess, reveals some personal qualms about favoring inefficient providers. The other, so the broader question is, what do people get out of this? In your argument is they will, if you, for example, block mergers that are efficient, that will lead to people getting less. Well, another answer, which is a little bit of a dodge until I finally face your question, is that I think even by your own metric, many of the mergers that have been allowed are not getting consumers, are frankly, by all metrics, not helping consumers. I think it's extremely hard to argue that consumers, for example, have been benefited by the airline mergers, by both of our metrics. Prices are about the same, but seats are smaller. There's all kinds of crazy fees. They can coordinate on fees, the competition. They can get away with things like raising change fees to $250. They all do it together. And in the old days, there used to be competitors who kind of put some pressure on that, but that's been removed. So I think that I think on some metrics, some of it is simply by a straightforward, are consumers better off or worse? So what is the final? But I want to face the hardest challenge, which is if consumers are going to lose, right? When is it worth it? What do you get out of it? I think this requires a view. The defense of it is that they get more of what they want as a citizen, even if they get less of what they want as a consumer. So the argument is that they live in a country where there is greater economic opportunity as a small producer, where there are greater choices as someone who buys things, even if they aren't always cheaper. You live in a country where I believe you would expect less political influence by a smaller number of companies. And finally, you live in a country which has stronger regional economies as opposed to being dominated by national companies. And that is, I think, the way the United States looked even 30 or 40 years ago, even in the 90s, it looked more like that. Certainly looked like that if you move further back. And I guess it comes back to my constitutional point of Congress getting to choose and there being an open debate. And I think there should be an open debate is as to how much the laws, even the antitrust laws, should focus on the prioritization of consumer surplus, of us as consumers, as opposed to the fact that we are also employees, most of us, workers, owners, producers, and voters and citizens. So that is the trade-off. Like many things, it's a leap of faith. But I think that politically, people are allowed to do it.
Do you envision, I think the last part of that in there is do you envision, commissioners at the FTC get to raise their hand and vote and decide what mergers to challenge. Mm-hmm. And so I have heard different views of what it means to sort of expand the value set of the antitrust objective function. And the first one was, we're going to make it public interest. And it seems like people have ran away from that. There's going to be 6 goals and not 1 or what have you. There's a let's set bright lines version of this, right? So, bring back the 1968 guidelines and 10% is that sort of thing. Mm-hmm. And then there's like a softer version. We're gonna keep consumer welfare, but I think you used the phrase sort of back of mind or earlier, but sort of back of mind. tiebreaker goes to deconcentration if it's a close call, or maybe even if it's not. In any of those kind of versions, well, in the 68 guidelines, I guess we're still doing market definition, so there's work to do. It's not really bright line. But do you have a specific vision about which of those, and I guess I again, and how comfortable are you that the Trump or Biden administration AAG will make those trade-offs, or 3 commissioners?
Right. So to be honest, it's a good question because I sometimes vacillate. So I think by my personal nature, I'm sort of slightly cautious person. It may, I have this sort of hope that the back of mind approach gets you where you want. You have the right kind of people who see what comes. But I've increasingly come to think that the problem that is too ineffective approach. It leads to too many, just a few cases on the margin and so forth. Yeah, I think I have leaned more towards if you're serious about this project. I think the first approach sort of leads you to the Obama administration, where you have people sort of say, okay, we really want to do some stuff. And then maybe sort of, well, let's wait for a good case, and well, that's complicated, or this, and then eventually, there's an enormous amount of concentration through the Obama administration. I was there for a lot of it, and like, well, they have a good argument about this, and so I've come out of government to be more favorable towards clearer structural guidelines, more like 68 guidelines, where you have rules that are relatively simple, like, you pick a number. We've sort of had this in the back of our head. I think we thought that, 5 to 4 was sort of suspicious. 4 to 3, really, you shouldn't let that happen. 3 to 2, forget it. But I even think that has eroded. And I was sort of, Sprint T-Mobile being a good example, where there's always some other reason. Oh, we know it's 4 to 3, but Sprint's failing, or so forth. No, so I think that if you believe in these values, if you believe in a more decentralized economy, you have to have something stronger than, we're really going to do something when the time comes. So that I've moved in that direction.
Let me broaden that out to the other panelists. I don't know if anybody who wants to respond to that, or I should just sort of move to the next question, but sort of thinking about how to assess those trade-offs in the antitrust system, or whether we're better served sort of having antitrust as a sort of mono objective function type system.
Well, I will say, Josh, that obviously clearer rules have their own virtue in terms of process cost, but their own vice in terms of substantive loss. And maybe it's a vocational problem being a judge, but it does seem to me that you always find there are compelling exceptions raised to a particular rule. I actually had investigated a 3-into-2 merger and ended up letting it happen because the story being told, it really checked out. There was 3 companies, they all did desktop stock quotation systems, and number 2, I think, wanted to acquire number 3. And the story was, and it was true, number 3 had no intention of and had not invested in the impending new technology. So number 2 was prepared to acquire the firm basically for the value of its customer list, so that they could hope to convert those customers to its system as number 3 became basically overtaken by time. So it wasn't a failing firm yet, but there was no particular reason to wait for it to fail. The writing was on the wall in terms of technology. So I don't know the particulars of T-Mobile into Sprint, but they were telling a story about very high levels of efficiencies with 5G. And a rule that prevents hearing that, and therefore occasionally accepting it, is going to be a costly rule. Now, even 68 were guidelines. They weren't hard and fast rules. And I presume that Tim would preserve that with some degree of flexibility, which makes me think that what you end up with is the cost without much of the benefit, because the exceptions are still going to arise, and there'll be deals that are deterred because they don't know that they can make that case.
Well, can I break in here and maybe
wait, Tim, can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Kades. Yeah.
So yeah, I'd like to push back on this, right? Because there is also a cost of a rule that insists that you do the perfect analysis in every case, because it means that government resources are spent litigating a whole bunch of cases that are costly. And so what you see is government merger litigations are all, they're to the point where they're almost having to go into court and litigate 2-to-1s. Because surprisingly enough, every company can come up with why their 2-to-1 is different, is the unicorn.
Wait a minute.
Right? And I think where that shows is, look at the hospital mergers and what the FTC has to do to show that the merger is not going to have pro-competitive benefits, despite the fact that the research is overwhelming. That that concentration in hospital systems has virtually no evidence that it actually benefits. And if you are going to say anything, the evidence seems to be larger hospital systems tend to be have lower quality. So you have to balance both of those.
Under existing merger law, and then Tim, let me let you respond, but under existing merger law, the P&B presumption says mergers are presumptively unlawful if the post-merger share is greater than 30. There has been one case in the history of the Clayton Act, one litigated case, and it was very recent, and you both named it, in which merging parties have successfully invoked an efficiencies defense. One. The number of merging parties that have successfully rebutted the P&B presumption once invoked is lower than it has been since P&B has been decided. You want a thumb on the scale, you can line up, talk about research, you can line up 100 economists. I can find one, John Quokka, I can find one who says that the P&B presumption, that the 30% is actually meaningful in some way, that it actually means what you would want it to mean under the law. That means the transaction makes it more likely than not that it's anti-competitive. So you got a huge thumb on your scale. I think your beef is with the agencies not bringing enough cases. They've got a thumb on the scale in the law. Nobody wins on an efficiencies defense. To be provocative, and then I'll let you respond, Tim, is what else do you want?
Well, as you said, first I want the agencies to bring the cases and judge and obviously and judges to now to respond to economic evidence. But even more, I was just going to bring up the point we were talking about rules and standards. Since this is the Scalia Law School we're at, every rule has costs. The nature of a rule is that it is going to have errors implicit in it. But the major thing that antitrust is not doing right now is providing adequate deterrence, I think, even through what you're talking about, Josh, because I think the presumption is, well known by the people in this room, but very hard to understand. And that's why I've come to think that, as I repeat, that I think that structural rules are more effective. Now, Josh, I guess what you're saying is that you already think there are structural rules, but I just think that it is extraordinary. Despite, I think the record suggests that over the last decade, despite this presumption, there's been a large number of mergers that got through that I think are regrettable from any criteria. So that suggests to me that something's wrong. And if we can't figure out some way to fix that, then the law has failed in its primary mandate.
Well, not to defend U.S. antitrust law, Tim, but you do talk about wireless and talk about 4-to-3, and the U.S. law has rejected 4-to-3 mergers in the U.S. market, including in the last one. And in terms of what the DOJ thought it did, is to preserve a fourth competitor. We can debate that or see how that works out. But the point is, the U.S. market for wireless, which is an important area to study because you can make international comparisons in particular. That's one nice thing. The U.S. has had a relatively low concentration ratio. It's not as if Japan and South Korea and Germany are way ahead of us from your standpoint. I mean, they have allowed 4 to 3 mergers, or the 3 across markets to basically evolve without that tumult that we have seen in the U.S. market. And the U.S. is doing very well on the metrics in terms of output, particularly, and we're doing well in terms of innovation. So I don't see where this deficit takes place, and particularly in the areas you talk about. You say airlines. Airlines have become very much more efficient. Obviously, with deregulation, we still have low-cost airlines. We can do. There are policy measures that we should be undertaking to try to improve that, but we've done relatively well. Cable TV was unleashed after a bad regulatory protectionist episode protecting broadcasting, and it came in, and finally, when we allowed head-to-head between telephones and cable, we got the broadband market, and the broadband market's doing pretty well by most international comparisons. In fact, by all international comparisons. So
I would agree with you, Tom. Now we can talk telecom policy. Up till about say 5 years ago, or 6 years ago, I would have agreed to you that U.S. telecom policy had major pro-competitive advantages. In fact, it was, in my opinion, doing better than antitrust overall. Namely, now we're not having a debate over rulemaking, but namely through the device of going forward with pro-competitive rules, like computer inquiries. I don't want to bore people with the fleet of FCC rulemakings that I think were pro-competitive. But even just, I'll take one, like number portability in the wireless space. You get to take your number. Obviously, something very makes it easier to switch. Something maybe you could have for social networking, but don't have. So yes, I would agree with you, but I think we have dropped the ball on telecom, and the pro-competitive spirit has become more of a pro-monopoly spirit. And the 4 to 3, which for a long time the U.S. held the line on 4 to 3, and in fact prevented AT&T from buying T-Mobile, which was an enormous benefit to consumers, because T-Mobile became the maverick, the price cutter, and so forth. And I think we've blown it, letting it go down to 3 again. I mean, supposedly 4, but we're waiting to see if the fourth competitor actually amounts to anything at all. I think we've blown it. We've had a successful structure, and let it go in telecom, and that's what I'm concerned about. And I know we're running out of time, so I don't want to spend the whole time on telecom, but I think telecom used to be in some ways be a model of how innovative competitive rules worked, and has lost sight also of its own tradition.
Let me take you back to airlines then for a minute and
Sure.
spot you a few mergers, because there were mergers in that industry that I think I would have opposed as Assistant Attorney General. Some of them were made by the Department of Transportation one. It had the jurisdiction, and I did file comments opposing. And then the USAA merger, U.S. American Airlines merger, made by the department, but not by the Antitrust Division. That case was opposed, and then mayors and governors had a word with the Attorney General, Eric Holder, about the impact on jobs in their localities, and all of a sudden the merger was approved. That's what you get when you bring politics into it, Tim.
I noticed where, Josh, you're probably... Well,
yeah,
we need to sum up, or...
I promised I would get us out the door at 75 minutes. Why don't we do the following? Why don't we sort of have a sum up round, and we'll call it a day. Tim, you want to start?
No, I got to go last.
Yeah, I think that's right.
The classic.
Why don't we repeat in the same order? So we'll go Tom, Michael, Judge, and Tim to finish us off. So Tom, how about you? You've got to unmute yourself.
I guess that may help. We'll see. I would like to endorse what Tim wrote 10 years ago in terms of the efficiency unleashed by companies, including Google and Amazon in the marketplace, and what great efficiencies those were. And to say that these firms are now a threat because they're large, they are large because they have been delivering efficiencies. And of course, that's where the discussion really has to start. We're not starting in the middle, we have to start at the beginning. And we can all agree that the investments made to establish very efficient net-based services has been impressive and important for consumers and society, and that innovation should continue and be part and central, in fact, to any discussion about what we do next.
Michael?
Yeah, well, first, I should have said this way before. Thank you so much for having me on this esteemed panel. So I would just sort of say, sort of overall, one, a little surprised to have heard anyone saying broadband is competitively a success story today. I think there are millions of Americans overpaying for it who would be surprised, and millions more who don't even have access to it. The second thing is, Josh, I think your point, like the thumb on the scale is unfair. And it's unfair, one, both because maybe you can find 100 economists who don't like Philadelphia National Bank. I can find leading IO economists who all think the problem is the structural presumption has been gutted, right? That's Carl Shapiro, that's John Baker, that's Fiona Scott Morton, that's Nancy Rose. So it's not this economist versus non-economist issue. And I think also I still come back to, when you look at what antitrust is doing, it is not a question of, it's doing the right, it's what it's attempting to do, protect competition, it's working, and the question is, should it be doing more? I think there's a fundamental question. It's not even doing what it's supposed to be doing. And that's why the government is spending decades litigating what should be the easy case. And that's why, and not spending resources looking for the Section 2 cases. And certainly that was my experience when I was at the commission. So I just can't be complacent. And one other unrelated point is, even going back to the rules, even if you block deal X, doesn't mean that it doesn't happen, right? So Dave Ballin has a great story about all the hospital mergers that the FTC blocked. The hospitals didn't die, they didn't go away. They ended up doing deals that were alternative deals. So I just sort of think, again, I guess I should have put that in before I did the complacency point. So I'll just stop there.
And Michael, I'll just say on P&B, because I've read those criticisms of the view on P&B very closely and written about it. Most of those criticisms about the P&B presumption being gutted are not about the courts; they're about the agencies. What they're saying is the agencies don't bring enough cases, and they should invoke the presumption more in court, and that it is the agencies that are crediting efficiencies. That's not happening in the courts. That's happening, and the agencies aren't bringing them. And that's why I wanted to push the question. Is it a matter of, agencies bringing more? I don't think that their problem is, P&B is not being gutted in federal court. I don't think anybody has argued that. Instead, you get economists making what I think is a policy and political argument that, we need the presumption because we should be winning more challenges than we are because people aren't believing our prima facie evidence. Well, that's a second, but it doesn't match up with the economic research. Doesn't mean that economists don't want it as a policy matter to solve some other problem. That's my criticism. And so I mean something very particular when I say economists don't think the presumption is right. I mean, economists don't buy the following statement: a post-merger share greater than 30 means a merger is more likely anti-competitive than not. A lot of economists don't think that is true, but support the presumption. So I'll spot you that for sure. But those are two different claims. And I just wanted to be clear I was making the former, not the latter.
Okay. But I think it's a court issue, not an agency issue. Just
one time in history. I mean, those are the facts. Doug?
Since Michael mentioned Carl Shapiro, and I just happened to have something in front of me I was going to mention. Now, bear in mind that a large theme in the book is that the consumer welfare standard has forced the antitrust exercise, the analysis, into a dry, technical one among economists that doesn't resonate not only with the public but with the values that Tim's talking about. Here's what Carl Shapiro said recently. There's a broad consensus among antitrust scholars and practitioners in favor of the consumer welfare standard. No evidence whatsoever has been put forward calling this consensus into question, close quote. I'm sorry we didn't have more time on big tech. Maybe we can do this again. I will venture to say that since I'm recused in Amazon and Google matters, since I'm a shareholder, but unfortunately not a controlling shareholder in either company, that you have to keep, it seems to me, some space open, and there's nothing in the book about this, for the possibility that the very large company, the dominant company in a particular market, is there because people simply prefer its product over that of others. My understanding of the statistics in Europe, where everybody gets a choice on their what their initial search engine is going to be when they boot up initially, and then of course we all have a choice later. 40% choose Google initially, and then 70% ultimately, and they end up doing 85 to 90% of the searches. People prefer the product and the trade-off that it entails in terms of their privacy. DuckDuckGo competes on that margin, but people like the product, and the firm is, maybe they've done some other things that are wrong, I don't know. But we have to leave room for the possibility that the product, the monopoly is a monopoly because it's a great company.
Tim, you've been a wonderful sport, and the floor is yours.
Thank you. I was going to talk about something else, but I do want to address what this last point about maybe the consumers prefer the product. And I tend to believe, this has been through all my writing, that I believe that companies, especially monopolies, tend to go through these life cycles. And I do believe that many companies get there on the merits. A company like Google, they didn't have a terrible product and force people to get it. I think they won fair and square. I think the mission of Section 2, the mission broadly of the antitrust law, is to keep a company like that on its toes and make sure that it doesn't shift from being, the innovator keeps making a better product to someone who decides it's cheaper to invest in exclusion or cheaper to invest in government remedies to avoid being displaced. And that's a long-standing view of mine. And you don't really know. And I think there's, people, sort of long assumed. In fact, one of Microsoft's defenses was that, people just like our operating system better, or they like Explorer better, and so forth. I think that the basic role of Section 2 is keeping a company in some level of insecurity, so it's forced to invest in innovation as opposed to barriers to entry. But let me start out with a much broader defense of what my book is about. So I think that we are in a time where there is a lot of dissatisfaction with the U.S. economy and how it works for people. That kind of goes in phases. People will always be somewhat dissatisfied. But I think the levels of dissatisfaction are extraordinarily high right now. And, obviously because of the pandemic, but even for other reasons. And there's a question of what side of history we're on and whether this enterprise of the antitrust law is in this moment, is able to adjust itself, as it had been in other eras, to preserve the market structure of the United States, to go with the basic premise that the government doesn't plan the economy, but still have some controls on the excesses of capitalism. And I don't think it's only antitrust that comes that way. I think there's other things like, minimum wage laws and so forth, that basic securities that are important for people to feel that they're getting a good deal. But I fundamentally think that we are in a period of much rethinking. And if we just think that, antitrust, if it improves its metrics for figuring out consumer welfare, is up to the job, I think is to miss something. There are many people who think antitrust just isn't up to it. That really, a lot of people on progressive side, and even people on the right, just think what you need is much more aggressive government action. And I guess I'm standing, maybe it's nostalgia for a tradition that says we can get there somewhere in the middle, trim some of the great excesses, and leave an economy that more people are happy with. I think antitrust is a part of that, particularly through its control of mergers, particularly because that's something that has been neglected. So I'll end on that note. And I want to again thank you guys. These questions are good. I particularly, this question of what is that trade-off that you're, what does antitrust really get for people is a hard question, because Social Security, money in your pocket, minimum wage, money in your pocket. A decentralized economy is a story of greater opportunity, maybe greater regional wealth, but it is more abstract. But I guess have a faith in it. I believe that trimming the excess of capitalism is important without throwing out the baby with the bathwater. So that's where I'll end.
Well, thank you, Tim, and thanks, Michael, Tom, and Judge for joining our first discussion forum. I'm sure there will be more, and one way or another we will get to continue the conversation. And so thank you all for joining, and we'll have this posted shortly. But thank you again.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Well,